There is a river in the American West that does more work and carries more weight than almost any river on Earth. It carves the mighty Grand Canyon. It fills the two largest reservoirs in the entire country. It lights cities with the power of its falling water. It grows a vast share of the food that fills the nation's tables. And it pours out of the taps of tens of millions of ordinary people who have never once stopped to think about where their water comes from. It is the Colorado River, and it is disappearing. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic collapse, but steadily, relentlessly, year after year, its flow diminishing, its great reservoirs falling toward levels that were once unthinkable. Its future thrown into a doubt so serious that the people whose job it is to manage the river now speak openly of a system on the edge. And the most sobering part of the whole story is the clock, because this is not a slow-motion problem that future generations will have to solve. The crisis is here now. The reservoirs are low now. The reckoning is arriving now. And America is running out of time to fix it. This is the story of the disappearing river, of how it came to sustain so much, of why it is vanishing, and of the race against the clock to save it before the damage becomes irreversible. Before we begin, one honest word. To say the river is disappearing does not mean it will vanish entirely tomorrow, or that the taps of every city will suddenly run dry. It means the river is shrinking to a point that threatens the whole system built upon it, and that the time to act is now, not later. What follows is a clear-eyed look at one of the most important and urgent stories in the country. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going, hitting subscribe. If you are finding this important, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your state or country in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. The river that built the West. To understand what is being lost, you first have to understand just how much the Colorado River does, because it is difficult to overstate the importance of this single stream of water to the life of the American West. The Colorado is not one of the world's largest rivers by volume. There are countless rivers that carry far more water. But few rivers on the planet have been made to work so hard or bear so much responsibility as the Colorado. It rises high in the Rocky Mountains, gathering the snowmelt of the peaks, and flows for well over 1,000 miles across some of the driest and most spectacular landscapes on the continent, carving deep canyons, filling great reservoirs, and eventually making its way toward the border with Mexico and, in wetter times, the sea. Along the way, its water is captured, stored, diverted, and delivered by one of the most elaborate systems of dams, reservoirs, canals, and aqueducts ever built. Through this vast infrastructure, the Colorado sustains an astonishing range of life and activity. It supplies water to great desert cities, metropolises of millions that could never have grown to their current size without it, carrying its water across mountains and deserts to reach the taps of their residents. The scale of this achievement is difficult to fully appreciate, for it required moving water across vast distances and formidable terrain, lifting it over mountains and channeling it through deserts, in a triumph of engineering that turned some of the most inhospitable land in the country into thriving centers of human life. It irrigates enormous areas of farmland, transforming desert into some of the most productive agricultural land in the country. Land that grows a huge share of the nation's vegetables and much of the fresh produce that fills grocery stores through the winter months. It generates electricity at its great dams, using the force of its falling water to power the region. It serves multiple states across the West, as well as a portion delivered to Mexico under long-standing treaty. In all, the Colorado River supports the lives of tens of millions of people, a scale of dependence that makes it one of the most vital rivers in the world. It is, in the truest sense, the river that built the modern West, the thread of water that made possible the cities, the farms, and the way of life of an entire region. And it is this river, this irreplaceable lifeline, that is now disappearing. The long journey of a vanishing river. To appreciate the crisis, it helps to follow the river on its journey, because the story of its disappearance is written along its entire length, from the mountains where it is born to the delta where it once met the sea. The Colorado begins as snow, falling on the high peaks of the Rocky Mountains through the winter, accumulating in a great white blanket that holds the water in frozen storage until the warmth of spring releases it. This mountain snowpack is the true source of the river, the reservoir in the sky that feeds the flow, and it is here, at the very beginning, that the crisis takes root. Because the snowpack has been diminishing, and more of what does fall is lost before it ever reaches the river. From the mountains, the gathering waters flow down into the upper reaches of the river, through the states where the river originates, and onward toward the first of the great reservoirs, where much of the flow is captured and stored. From there the river continues, released through a great dam and flowing on through the Grand Canyon, that vast and awesome chasm carved by the river over millions of years, before reaching the second of the great reservoirs, the largest in the country. Below this, the water is drawn off to serve the cities and farms of the lower river, diverted through canals and aqueducts that carry it far from the river's banks, until what remains continues toward the border and the delta beyond. Once, the river reached all the way to the sea, spreading across a great delta of wetlands and channels before mingling with the ocean. But so completely is the river now used, so thoroughly is every drop claimed and diverted, that in most years it no longer reaches the sea at all, its flow entirely consumed before it can complete its ancient journey. This is perhaps the most striking single fact about the disappearing river, that a great river which once flowed to the ocean now runs dry before it gets there, its waters spread across the thirsty land until nothing is left. The journey of the Colorado is thus a journey of a river being used up drop by drop along its entire length, and understanding that journey is the beginning of understanding what is being lost. The 40 million who depend on it. It is worth pausing to grasp the sheer scale of human dependence on this single river, because it is that dependence that makes its disappearance so consequential. Across the states and regions it serves, the Colorado River provides water to a population numbering in the tens of millions, supplying homes, businesses, and communities throughout a vast area of the West. Great cities draw a significant share of their water from the river, piping it across enormous distances to reach the taps of their residents. And for these cities, the Colorado is not a minor supplement, but a foundational source, one whose reliability underpins the daily life of their populations. When you consider the millions of people in these cities, all of them turning on their taps each day and expecting water to flow, you begin to grasp what is at stake in the decline of the river. Beyond the cities, the river sustains the agricultural heart of the West, watering farms that grow an enormous quantity of the food consumed across the entire country. The produce grown with Colorado River water reaches far beyond the region, into the grocery stores and onto the tables of people who have never heard of the river and could not point to it on a map, and yet who eat its water, in a sense, every day. When we consider that the river supports both the urban populations of great desert cities and the agricultural output that feeds much of the nation, the true scale of what is at stake in its decline comes into focus. This is not a river whose troubles affect only a small or distant group of people. It is a river woven into the fabric of American life, its water present in the food we eat and the cities where millions live. Its disappearance is therefore not a regional curiosity, but a matter of national significance, a crisis whose consequences would ripple far beyond the boundaries of the arid West. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Did you have any idea that a single river feeds so much of the country's food and so many of its cities? Drop a yes or no in the comments, because your answers help us understand what surprises people most, and I read every reply. Okay, back to it. The original sin of over-allocation. To understand why the river is disappearing, we have to go back to the beginning, to a decision made a century ago that planted the seed of the crisis, a mistake so fundamental that it has been called the original sin of the Colorado River. 100 years ago, the states of the region came together to divide the river's water among themselves, to establish who would get how much, and to provide the certainty that would allow the great cities and farms to grow. The agreement they reached, the foundational compact that still governs the river today, divided the water between an upper group of states, where the river originates, and a lower group, where much of the population and farmland would develop. And it set out how much water each would receive. But there was a fatal flaw in this agreement. one that would not become fully apparent for generations. The amount of water the states divided among themselves was based on measurements taken during a period that, as later study revealed, was unusually wet, a stretch of years when the river carried more water than it typically does over the long run. In other words, the states divided up more water than the river actually provides. They built the entire framework of rights and allocations on an assumption of abundance that was never true, promising, on paper, more water than the river could reliably deliver. This over-allocation is the original sin, the fundamental imbalance baked into the management of the river from the very start. A chronic overcommitment that meant the region was living beyond the river's means almost from the beginning. For decades, this discrepancy was hidden, masked by the great reservoirs that stored water from the wetter years and made up the difference. But an overdrawn account can only be sustained for so long, and as the drought deepened and the reservoirs were drawn down, the underlying imbalance was finally exposed. The disappearing river is, in a profound sense, the reckoning for a promise that could never be kept. The moment when the gap between what was promised and what the river actually provides could no longer be hidden. The great reservoirs and their terrible decline. Nowhere is the disappearance of the river more visible than in its two great reservoirs, the enormous artificial lakes that store its water and that have become the most watched gauges of the entire crisis. These reservoirs, the largest in the country, were built to hold several years' worth of the river's flow, a vast reserve designed to buffer the region against dry years and to guarantee a reliable supply even when the river ran low. When they were full, they represented an almost unimaginable quantity of water, stored against the uncertainty of the desert. And for much of their history they were kept relatively full, a comfortable cushion that made the whole system work. They were, in effect, the savings account of the West, the reserve that allowed the region to weather the natural ups and downs of the river. But the sustained decline of the river has drawn these reservoirs down dramatically, until they have fallen to levels that would have seemed impossible a generation ago, reaching historic lows and exposing the pale, bleached rings of rock along their shorelines that mark how far the water has dropped. These bathtub rings, as they are called, have become the defining image of the crisis, a stark visual record of the disappearance. A line drawn across the canyon walls showing where the water used to be and how far it has fallen. Where boats once floated, dry ground now stretches. Where marinas once sat at the water's edge, they have been left stranded far from the retreating shore, and the falling water has even uncovered things long hidden beneath the surface, eerie revelations of just how much has been lost. But the falling reservoirs are more than a striking image, because as they decline, they approach thresholds that carry catastrophic consequences. There is a level below which the great dams can no longer generate hydroelectric power, cutting off electricity for the region. And there is a lower level still, sometimes called dead pool, at which water can no longer pass through the dam at all. A scenario that would sever the supply to everyone downstream. The decline of the reservoirs toward these thresholds is the countdown at the heart of the crisis, the reason that America is running out of time, because every foot the reservoirs fall brings the system closer to the point of catastrophic failure. The signs you can see with your own eyes for those who wonder whether the disappearance of the river is real or exaggerated. The answer is written across the landscape in signs that anyone can see, visible evidence of the decline that has become impossible to ignore. The most famous of these is the great pale ring that now encircles the reservoirs. The bleached band of rock along the shorelines that marks how far the water has fallen, a stark and unmistakable record of the decline that has become an icon of the entire crisis. This ring grows taller with every year that the water drops, a widening band of bare stone climbing the canyon walls, and it speaks silently but powerfully of just how much water has been lost, in a language that requires no expertise to understand. But the bathtub ring is only the most famous of the visible signs. Around the shrinking reservoirs, boat ramps and marinas that once sat at the water's edge have been left stranded far from the retreating shore, forced to relocate or close as the water pulled away from them. Docks that once floated have come to rest on dry ground, and the recreation that the reservoirs support has been disrupted as the water has withdrawn. The falling water has even uncovered features and objects long hidden beneath the surface, eerie revelations that have captured public attention and driven home the scale of what is being lost. Along the river itself, in the driest places, the flow has diminished visibly, and the once mighty delta at the river's end has largely dried to a cracked and barren expanse where a great wetland once thrived. These are not abstract statistics, but visible realities, changes to the landscape that anyone can witness, and together they paint an undeniable picture of a river in retreat. The signs you can see with your own eyes are the proof of the disappearance, the physical evidence that the crisis is real, present, and unfolding now, and they are a powerful reminder that this is not a distant or hypothetical problem, but one that is reshaping the landscape of the West before our very eyes. The mega-drought that will not end. The immediate cause of the river's disappearance is a drought, but not an ordinary one, because the West has been gripped by a dry spell so long and so severe that scientists have reached for a stronger word to describe it: a mega-drought. One of the most extreme and sustained periods of dryness the region has experienced in many centuries. For more than 2 decades, the West has endured a stretch of years with far less water than normal, a relentless dryness that has reduced the snowpack, diminished the rivers, and drawn down the reservoirs year after year, with only occasional wetter years to interrupt the decline. This is not a passing dry season, but a prolonged assault on the region's water. A drought of a depth and duration that has tested the entire system to its limits. What makes this mega-drought so alarming is not only its severity, but its persistence, the way it has refused to break, dragging on year after year and defying the hope that a return to normal was just around the corner. Each year that the drought continues, the reservoirs fall further, the margin of safety narrows, and the crisis deepens, and the sheer duration of the dryness has worn away the reserves that once cushioned the region against hard times. The mega-drought has revealed just how vulnerable the West is to a lack of water, how thin the margin really is between abundance and crisis, and how quickly the great reserves can be drawn down when the water stops coming. It is the immediate engine of the disappearing river, the dry years that have exposed the underlying over-allocation and driven the reservoirs toward their critical lows. And the deep concern among those who study the region is that this is not merely a temporary drought that will eventually end, but something more lasting, a shift toward a fundamentally drier climate that may not reverse. A possibility that transforms the crisis from a hardship to be waited out into a new reality that must be adapted to. The warming that steals the water beneath the mega-drought lies an even deeper and more troubling force, the warming of the climate, which is stealing water from the river in ways that go beyond any temporary lack of rain and snow. The West has been growing hotter, and this rising temperature affects the river in several ways at once, each of them reducing the flow. Higher temperatures cause more of the mountain snow to evaporate directly into the air before it can melt into the streams, a loss that removes water from the system before it ever reaches the river. Warmer temperatures also dry out the soils, so that when the snow does melt, more of the water is soaked up by the parched ground before it can run off into the river, and they increase the evaporation of water from the reservoirs and the landscape, lifting still more of it away into the thirsty air. The result is that even in years with reasonable snowfall, less water ultimately reaches the river than once did, a persistent erosion of the flow that operates independent of the year-to-year swings of the weather. This warming-driven decline is in some ways more frightening than the drought itself, because it is not a passing phase, but a lasting change, a steady reduction in the river's flow that grows as the climate continues to warm. Scientists have found that a significant portion of the river's decline can be attributed to this warming, and they warn that as temperatures continue to rise, the river is likely to shrink further still, regardless of how much snow falls in any given year. This is why many experts now describe the situation not as a drought, which implies an eventual end, but as aridification, a fundamental drying of the region that represents a new and lasting normal. The warming that steals the water is the deepest reason that America is running out of time, because it means the river is not simply passing through a dry spell, but undergoing a permanent transformation, shrinking toward a new and smaller size that the region has not yet learned to live within. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are getting value from this, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends in the West, or anyone who cares about where their water and food come from, share this with them, because it is genuinely important to understand. One like, one share to someone you care about, and let's keep going. The power that could go dark, one of the least understood but most serious consequences of the disappearing river, lies in the electricity that its great dams produce. Because these dams are not only reservoirs and water delivery structures, but power plants, and the shrinking river threatens to silence them. The great dams of the Colorado generate hydroelectric power, using the force of the water falling through them to spin turbines and produce electricity that flows into the grid, serving millions of people across the region. This power has long been valued not only for its reliability, but for its cleanliness, produced without burning any fuel, and it has been a quiet, dependable part of the region's energy supply for generations, so taken for granted that few people ever think about it. But the amount of power a dam can generate depends directly on the level of the water in the reservoir behind it, because the higher the water and the greater the pressure driving the turbines, the more electricity the dam produces. As the reservoirs have fallen, the power the dams generate has diminished, and if the water were to fall below the level of the intakes that feed the turbines, the dams would stop generating power altogether. The prospect of losing this hydroelectric power is one of the serious dangers of the disappearing river, because it would remove a large source of clean, reliable electricity from the grid at a time when the demand for power is growing, forcing the region to make up the difference from other, often more expensive or more polluting sources. The threat to the power is another dimension of how deeply the river is woven into the life of the region, providing not only the water that sustains cities and farms, but the electricity that helps power them. And the disappearing river puts both at risk at once. The lights that the river helps to keep on could dim as it vanishes, a reminder that the crisis reaches into every corner of modern life. The priority system and the unequal burden as the river disappears and the water must be shared among too many claimants, a hidden architecture determines who loses their water first. An intricate system of rights and priorities that shapes the fate of everyone who depends on the river. The Colorado is not shared equally or freely, but according to a complex body of law and agreement built up over the past century that assigns different users different priorities. Some hold senior rights, meaning their claim to the water comes first and is protected until the shortages grow severe, while others hold junior rights, meaning their claim comes later and they are cut first when reductions must be made. This order of priority is not a minor technicality, but a decisive factor in determining who bears the burden of the disappearing river. The system divides the river among the upper and lower groups of states and sets out the obligations for how much water must be delivered downstream, and within this framework the different states, cities, and users occupy different positions, some more protected and some more exposed. When shortages are declared and cuts must be made, they fall first on the junior users, sparing the senior ones until the crisis deepens further. This means that the burden of the disappearing river falls unevenly, striking hardest at those with the most junior rights, regardless of their need or their size. Farms with junior priority have already faced deep cuts, forced to fallow their fields, while other users have been spared. States that agreed long ago to junior positions now find themselves first in line to lose their water. This unequal distribution of the burden is one of the most contentious aspects of the entire crisis, because those who face the deepest cuts naturally feel the unfairness of bearing so much of the pain while others are protected. And yet the priority system that determines who loses first is deeply embedded in a century of law and agreement that cannot easily be changed. The tension between the legal reality of the priority system and the sense of fairness about who should sacrifice is at the heart of the difficult negotiations over the river's future. And it makes the task of sharing the shortage not only a practical challenge, but a moral and political one, a question of justice as much as of water. The priority system is thus a crucial part of the story, because it determines not just that the river is disappearing, but who suffers as it does. And it is at the heart of the difficult and often bitter negotiations over how to share the shrinking supply. Understanding this hidden architecture is essential to understanding why the crisis is so contentious, and why finding a fair way to distribute the pain has proven so difficult. The cities standing in the path, the great cities of the West, stand among those most exposed to the disappearing river, because they have grown to enormous size on the assumption of a reliable water supply that is now in doubt. Across the region, metropolitan areas of millions depend on the Colorado for a significant share of their water, and as the river declines, these cities face the prospect of reductions in a supply they have come to take for granted. Some cities are more exposed than others, depending on their sources and their priority. But all of them must reckon with the reality that the river on which they depend is shrinking, and that they may have to learn to live with less. The cities have responded to this threat with varying degrees of urgency and success. Some have become remarkable leaders in conservation, dramatically reducing their water use even as their populations grow, through the removal of thirsty grass, the recycling of water, and the cultivation of a culture of careful use. Others have diversified their sources, reducing their dependence on the vulnerable river, and some have built infrastructure to secure their supplies even as the reservoirs fall. But the fundamental challenge remains that the cities have grown large in a desert, and their continued prosperity depends on water that is becoming scarcer. The disappearing river forces a profound question upon these cities. The question of whether they can continue to grow as they have, or whether their expansion must eventually be constrained by the limits of their water. This is one of the deepest challenges the crisis poses, not the immediate threat of the taps running dry, which the city's preparations make unlikely in the near term, but the longer term, reckoning with the limits of growth in an age of shrinking water. How the cities of the West answer this question will shape the future of the entire region. Some cities have shown that remarkable things are possible, reducing their water use so dramatically through conservation that they have continued to grow while drawing less water than before, proving that a desert city can adapt to scarcity without sacrificing its prosperity. Others have lagged, continuing to expand in ways that assume an abundance the river can no longer provide. And the contrast between them offers a lesson in how differently cities can respond to the same threat. The most exposed cities, those that depend heavily on the river and have the fewest alternatives, face the sharpest challenge, while those with diverse sources and a strong record of conservation are better positioned to weather the decline. But no city can consider itself entirely safe, because the disappearance of the river is a challenge that reaches them all, and the era in which water could be assumed to be limitless has come for the cities of the West to a decisive end. The farms that feed the nation, if the cities command the most attention, it is the farms that use the most water. And the disappearing river poses a profound threat to the agriculture that depends on the Colorado, and through it, to the food supply of the entire nation. The great majority of the river's water goes not to cities, but to farms, to the vast irrigated fields that produce an enormous share of the nation's food, including much of the fresh produce that Americans eat. Especially in the winter months, when little else can be grown. These farms are a crucial part of the national food supply, and they rest entirely on the reliable delivery of the river's water, a delivery that the shrinking river increasingly cannot guarantee. As the river disappears and the reductions deepen, it is often the farms, particularly those with junior water rights, that bear the earliest and heaviest cuts, forced to follow their fields, to switch to less thirsty crops, or to reduce their production as their share of the water is curtailed. These adjustments have real consequences for the farmers whose livelihoods depend on the water, for the rural communities that the agricultural economy supports, and potentially for the supply and the price of food for consumers across the country. The disappearing river thus reaches into the food supply of the nation, tying the fate of distant farms to the tables of people everywhere. The farms also sit at the center of the difficult debate over how to respond to the crisis. Because they use so much of the water that any serious effort to reduce demand must involve agriculture, raising painful questions about how to balance the needs of farms against those of cities, and about the future of farming in a region where the water is running short. The plight of the farms is a central part of the disappearing river. A reminder that the crisis is not only about the water in the taps, but about the food on the tables of the nation. There is a difficult tension at the heart of the matter, because the farms use so much of the water that any serious reduction in the region's overall use must involve agriculture, and yet the farms produce food that the nation needs. So that cutting their water carries real costs for everyone. Some have proposed shifting water from the farms to the growing cities, paying farmers to fallow their fields or to conserve, And while such arrangements can ease the urban shortages, they raise hard questions about the future of the agricultural communities and the food they produce. The challenge is to find a way to reduce the water used by agriculture without destroying the farming and the rural way of life that depend on it, a balance that has proven extraordinarily difficult to strike. The farms embody the central dilemma of the disappearing river, the reality that the water must be shared among competing needs that cannot all be fully met, and that the reductions required to save the river will fall, inevitably, on uses that matter deeply to real people and to the nation as a whole. The forgotten claimants and the living river amid the contest between the cities and the farms and the states, there are other claimants on the disappearing river whose voices have often been overlooked, and their stories add important dimensions to the crisis. Among them are the Native American tribes of the region, many of whom hold significant and often senior rights to the river's water, rights that were long ignored or unfulfilled even as the cities and farms took their share. The tribes have their own deep and ancient connection to the river and their own pressing needs for the water. And as the crisis unfolds and the reckoning over the river's future proceeds, their rights and their needs have become an increasingly important part of the story, a matter of justice as well as of water. The disappearing river forces a reckoning not only with scarcity, but with the long-neglected claims of those who were there first. There is also the river itself, the living river, and the natural world that depends upon it, a claimant that has no voice in the negotiations, but whose fate is bound up with the crisis. The Colorado is not only a supply of water for human use, but a living ecosystem, home to fish and wildlife, and the web of life that has always depended on its flow. And the disappearance of the river threatens all of this. The delta where the river once met the sea, once a vast and thriving expanse of wetlands teeming with life, has largely dried up as the river's flow has been consumed, a stark example of the environmental cost of using a river to its very limit and beyond. The living river reminds us that the crisis is not only a human one, that the water sustains more than cities and farms, and that a river drawn down to nothing is a loss not only for the people who depend on it, but for the natural world it once nourished. The fish that evolved in its waters, the birds that once filled its delta, the whole intricate web of life that grew up along its banks over countless ages, all of these are threatened as the river vanishes. A quiet extinction of the natural richness that the river once sustained, unfolding largely out of sight of the people who depend on the same water. These forgotten claimants, the tribes and the living river, are an essential part of the full story of the disappearing Colorado, a reminder that the crisis touches questions of justice and of the health of the natural world, not only of water supply. All right, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me. But quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about the Colorado River, you clearly care about this stuff, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time, promise, let's finish. A century of building and believing to understand the depth of the crisis. It helps to understand the mindset that created it. The century of building and believing that shaped the American West and that now confronts its hard reckoning. The great era of dam building and water development on the Colorado was an age of tremendous confidence. A time when it seemed that human ingenuity and engineering could overcome any obstacle, that the desert could be made to bloom, and that the water would always be there to sustain whatever was built. The great dams, the vast canals, the sprawling cities, and the endless farms were monuments to this confidence, testaments to the belief that the West could grow without limit, that the river could be harnessed to serve an ever-expanding population and economy. This confidence was not entirely misplaced, for the achievements it produced were genuinely remarkable, transforming a harsh and arid land into a place where great cities and productive farms could flourish. But it rested on an assumption that has proven false, the assumption of endless abundance. The belief that the river would always provide and that growth could continue indefinitely. For decades, this assumption seemed to hold, as the region grew and prospered and the water continued to flow, and the warnings of those who cautioned that the river was over-allocated and that the good years would not last were easy to ignore. The disappearing river is, in a sense, the collision between this century of building and believing and the hard reality of a finite and shrinking resource. The moment when the assumptions that drove the growth of the West have finally been overtaken by the limits of the water. To understand the crisis is to understand this history. To see how a mindset of boundless confidence built a great civilization in the desert on a foundation of water that could not, in the end, support it all, and to recognize that the reckoning now underway is the delayed consequence of choices made across a century of growth. The race against the clock. We come now to the heart of the matter, to the reason this crisis is so urgent, because the disappearing river is not a slow-moving problem that can be addressed at leisure, but a race against the clock, a countdown measured in the falling levels of the great reservoirs. The reason America is running out of time is that the reservoirs have fallen so far that they are approaching the critical thresholds beyond which the system begins to break. The levels at which power generation ceases, and, below that, at which water can no longer pass through the dams at all. The prospect of the reservoirs reaching these levels, once a distant nightmare, has become a real and pressing danger, and the effort to keep them above the brink has become a desperate scramble against time. The urgency of the situation has already forced emergency actions, negotiated cutbacks, and frantic efforts to reduce the water taken from the river in order to slow the decline of the reservoirs and keep them functioning. The people responsible for managing the river have spoken openly of the possibility of the system approaching a point of failure, and they have called for dramatic reductions in the use of the water to pull the reservoirs back from the edge. This is what it means to run out of time, that the buffer which once protected the region has been nearly exhausted, that the margin for error has shrunk to almost nothing, and that decisions which were once put off for the future must now be made immediately. The race against the clock is not a metaphor, but a literal reality, a contest between the falling reservoirs and the efforts to save them, and its outcome will determine whether the region can avoid the catastrophic failure of the system or whether it will cross the thresholds into genuine disaster. Every year of continued drought, every foot the reservoirs fall, brings the moment of reckoning closer, and the window for action grows narrower. This is the urgency at the heart of the disappearing river, the reason the crisis cannot wait. What Deadpool would actually mean to understand the true stakes of the race against the clock, it is worth looking directly at the worst-case scenario, the outcome that all the emergency efforts are designed to prevent. Because seeing it clearly reveals just how serious the crisis has become. At the bottom of each great reservoir lies a level known as dead pool, the point at which the water has fallen so low that it can no longer flow through the outlets of the dam and pass downstream. Above this level, even when power generation has ceased, water can still be released to the users below. But at dead pool, the reservoir becomes a trap, holding its remaining water behind the concrete with no way to send it onward. Were a reservoir to reach this point, the consequences would be catastrophic, because it would sever the flow of water to everyone downstream, to the cities and farms that depend on the releases, creating a crisis of a scale the region has never experienced. The prospect of dead pool, once a distant and almost theoretical concern, has in recent years become a real danger discussed openly by the people who manage the river, a sign of just how far the reservoirs have fallen and how narrow the margin has become. It is the specter of this outcome that has driven the desperate efforts to reduce water use and keep the reservoirs above the critical levels. Because crossing into dead pool would be a disaster affecting millions. Understanding what dead pool would mean helps to explain the urgency of the crisis, why the falling reservoirs are watched with such anxiety, and why the region is racing against time to pull them back from the edge. It is not a certainty, and the efforts to prevent it may well succeed. But the fact that it is discussed at all, that it has moved from the realm of the unthinkable to that of the possible, is a measure of how serious the disappearance of the river has become. Dead pool is the cliff at the end of the road, the outcome that gives the race against the clock its terrible urgency, and the entire effort to save the river is, in a sense, an effort to keep the reservoirs from ever reaching it. The difficult work of sharing the pain. Faced with the race against the clock, the states and users of the river have been forced into the difficult and often bitter work of negotiating how to share the shrinking supply. a process that is as much a test of cooperation as of engineering, and that lies at the center of the effort to save the river. Because the river is shared among so many parties, each with its own rights, needs, and interests, deciding how to reduce the overall use of the water and how to distribute the pain of those reductions is enormously complicated and contentious. The negotiations pit states against one another, cities against farms, and present needs against future obligations, and they are shaped by the intricate legal framework that governs the river, which gives different users different rights and priorities. Reaching agreement has been challenging, and the process has been marked by hard bargaining, temporary deals, missed deadlines, and the constant pressure of the falling reservoirs forcing action. There have been moments when it seemed the parties might fail to agree, when the threat loomed that the crisis would spiral out of control, and the difficulty of getting so many competing interests to accept painful cuts has repeatedly tested the limits of cooperation. Yet there have also been real achievements, agreements to reduce usage and to keep the system functioning, born of the recognition that the alternative, an uncontrolled collapse of the river's management, would be far worse for everyone. The difficult work of sharing the pain is a profound test of whether the region can come together in the face of a common threat, whether the states and users can set aside their rivalries and accept the sacrifices needed to save the river. The outcome of these negotiations will shape the future of the entire West, and the success or failure of the effort to share the pain fairly and effectively is one of the central dramas of the disappearing river, a test of governance and cooperation on which the fate of millions depends. What makes these negotiations so fraught is that they force the parties to confront, at last, the gap between the water they were promised and the water that actually exists, to accept that the old allocations cannot all be honored, and that someone must give something up. Every party comes to the table with its own history, its own rights, and its own sense of what it is owed, and reaching agreement means persuading each of them to accept less than it believes it deserves. A task that tests the limits of trust and compromise. And looming over the whole process is the pressure of the falling reservoirs, the knowledge that if the parties cannot agree, the crisis may force outcomes on everyone that are worse than any negotiated deal. It is a high-stakes contest between cooperation and conflict, and the fact that the parties have so far managed, however imperfectly, to keep reaching agreements is one of the more hopeful aspects of the crisis, a sign that the recognition of a shared threat can at least sometimes overcome the divisions that scarcity breeds. The solutions that could save the river for all the seriousness of the crisis, the story of the disappearing river, is not one of inevitable doom, because there exists a real and growing set of solutions that could slow the decline and help the region live within the limits of the shrinking river, and it is worth understanding what these solutions are and what they could achieve. The most fundamental is conservation, the reduction of the water that cities and farms use. And the experience of the region has shown that enormous savings are possible. Cities have dramatically reduced their consumption through the removal of decorative grass, the installation of efficient fixtures, the recycling and reuse of water, and the cultivation of a culture that values every drop, in some cases even shrinking their total water use while their populations grow. In agriculture, which uses the most water, there is significant potential to improve efficiency through better irrigation techniques, the lining of canals, and the shifting of crops and practices, though these changes can be costly and difficult. Beyond conservation, the region is pursuing other strategies. The reuse and recycling of water can multiply the value of every drop. The banking of water underground, storing it in aquifers in wet years for use in dry ones, can build a buffer against shortage. For some areas, the removal of salt from seawater offers a new, if costly, source of supply. And there are proposals, some ambitious and controversial, to bring in water from elsewhere or to reduce the demand in other ways. Underlying all of these is the essential work of bringing the region's use of the river into balance with what the river actually provides, of correcting, at last, the original over-allocation that lies at the root of the crisis. None of these solutions is a complete answer on its own, and none is easy or cheap, but together they offer a genuine path toward a sustainable future, a way for the region to endure the disappearance of the river's former abundance and to live within the limits of the water that remains. What happens to the river will depend, more than anything. On how fully and how quickly these solutions are embraced, and on whether the region can summon the will to act before the crisis deepens beyond repair. It is important to be realistic about these solutions, because none of them offers an easy escape from the fundamental reality that the river is shrinking and that the region must learn to use less. Conservation, powerful as it is, has limits, and there is only so much water that can be squeezed out of more efficient use before the essential needs of cities and farms are reached. The reuse of water, the banking of supplies, and the development of new sources all help, but they are costly and take time, and they cannot fully replace the water that is being lost. The removal of salt from seawater, often held up as a solution, is expensive and demands a great deal of energy, and it can serve only the coastal areas, not the vast inland regions that depend on the river. The proposals to import water from elsewhere face enormous obstacles of cost, engineering, and politics. The hard truth is that there is no single, painless solution. No technological miracle that will restore the river's former abundance, and the only real path forward is the difficult one of using less, sharing the shortage, and adapting to a drier future. The solutions can soften the blow and buy time, and together they can make the difference between a managed adaptation and an uncontrolled collapse. But they cannot change the fundamental reality that the region must learn to live within the limits of a diminished river. Recognizing this is itself an essential part of the response, because only by accepting the true nature of the challenge can the region make the hard choices that meeting it requires. What running out of time really means is worth pausing to consider carefully what it means to say that America is running out of time. Because the phrase captures something important about the nature of this crisis that distinguishes it from many others. Running out of time means that the problem cannot be deferred, that the comfortable assumption that there will always be more time to act has been overtaken by the reality of the falling reservoirs and the shrinking river. For decades, the over-allocation of the river was a problem that could be put off, hidden by the reserves in the reservoirs, allowing the region to avoid the hard choices. But those reserves have now been nearly exhausted, and the buffer that allowed the region to delay is gone, so that the choices which were once postponed must now be made immediately, under the pressure of a crisis that is already upon us. Running out of time also means that the consequences of failure are drawing near, that the catastrophic outcomes which were once distant possibilities, the loss of power generation, the severing of the water supply, the collapse of the system's ability to function, are now real dangers that could arrive within years rather than generations. It means that the actions taken now, in this narrow window, will determine whether the region can avoid these outcomes or whether it will be caught unprepared by the deepening crisis. And it means that the warming climate, which continues to shrink the river, is steadily narrowing the window still further, so that each year of delay makes the challenge harder and the margin for action smaller. To run out of time is not to say that all is lost, for there is still a window, still a chance to act, but it is to say that the window is closing, that the time for comfortable delay is over, and that the region must act with urgency and determination now, while it still can. This is the true meaning of the crisis, the reason it demands attention not someday, but today. And the reason the story of the disappearing river is one of the most urgent in the country. The human cost behind the numbers behind all the discussion of reservoir levels and water rights and negotiations lie real human beings, and it is worth remembering that the disappearing river is, at its heart, a human story, one that reaches into the lives, the livelihoods, and the futures of millions of people. For the farmers whose fields depend on the river, the shrinking supply is not an abstraction, but a threat to everything they have built, to the land that has been in their families for generations, to the crops they grow, and the living they make, and the cutbacks they face mean followed fields, lost income, and an uncertain future. For the rural communities that depend on agriculture, the reduction of the water threatens the economic foundation of their existence, and the decline of the farms can hollow out the towns and the ways of life that have grown up around them. For the residents of the great cities, the crisis brings restrictions and rising costs, the browning of lawns, the limits on water use, the anxiety of living in a place whose water future is uncertain, and a growing awareness that the abundance once taken for granted can no longer be assumed. For the tribes whose rights to the river were long neglected, the crisis raises profound questions of justice, of whether their claims will finally be honored even as the water grows scarce. And for the tens of millions who depend on the river without ever thinking about it, the crisis, if it deepens, could touch the most basic elements of their lives: the water in their taps, the food on their tables, the electricity in their homes. The human cost behind the numbers is the true measure of the crisis, the reason it matters so profoundly. And it is a reminder that the disappearing river is not merely an environmental or economic problem, but a human one, whose resolution will shape the lives and the futures of countless people across the West and beyond. To see the crisis clearly is to see the human faces behind it, the farmers and the city dwellers and the tribal members and all the others whose lives are bound up with the fate of the vanishing river. The warning for a thirsty world, the story of the disappearing Colorado, is in the end larger than a single river, because it is a preview of a challenge that many regions around the world will face as the climate warms and the demand for water grows, and it carries lessons that reach far beyond the American West. The Colorado is among the first and most dramatic examples of a vital water source being pushed beyond its limits by the combination of drought, warming, and human demand. And how the region responds to the crisis will offer lessons, whether of success or of failure, for the many other places that will confront similar pressures in the years ahead. Rivers and water systems across the world are coming under strain, and the challenge of living within the limits of a shrinking supply, of sharing a diminishing resource fairly, and of adapting to a drier future is one that will increasingly define the human relationship with water everywhere. In this sense, the disappearing river is a warning, a signal of what lies ahead for a thirsty world, and the American West has become a kind of testing ground where the strategies for coping with water scarcity are being developed and tried. The lessons learned there about conservation, about the reuse of water, about the management of shared resources, about the difficult work of cooperation in the face of scarcity may prove valuable to communities and nations far from the Colorado as they confront their own water challenges. The crisis of the Colorado is thus not only a regional or national story, but a global one, a window into the future of water in a warming world, and a reminder that the challenge of stewarding a finite and precious resource is one that humanity as a whole will increasingly have to face. To watch the disappearing river is to watch a preview of the challenges to come, and to learn from the region's response, its successes and its failures alike, is to prepare for a future in which water scarcity will be one of the defining challenges of the age. The choice that lies before us as we bring this exploration toward its close. We arrive at the fundamental choice that the disappearing river places before the region and the nation, because in the end, the fate of the river is not fixed, but depends on the decisions that people make in the face of the crisis. The forces driving the river's decline, the mega-drought and the warming climate, are largely beyond any immediate human control, and they are likely to continue, which means the region cannot count on the river recovering to its former abundance. But within the scope of what people can control, the choices about how to respond are decisive, and they will determine whether the crisis leads to catastrophe or to a difficult but successful adaptation. The region can choose to conserve aggressively, to share the shortage fairly, to bring its use into balance with the river, to protect the reservoirs, and to cooperate in the face of the common threat, and these choices could see it through. Or it can fail to act, delay the hard decisions, and allow the crisis to deepen toward the catastrophic outcomes that loom at the bottom of the falling reservoirs. This is the choice that lies before us, and it is a choice that must be made now, in the narrow window that remains. The disappearing river is a test of whether a modern society can recognize a slow-building crisis in time, can set aside its rivalries and its comfortable assumptions, and can act with the urgency and the wisdom that the moment demands. It is a test that the region is taking right now, in the difficult negotiations, the emergency cutbacks, and the determined efforts to conserve and adapt, and the outcome is not yet decided. The Colorado River is disappearing, drawn down by drought and warming and a century of overuse, and America is running out of time to save it. But the story is not yet written, and the ending depends on the choices still to be made. The river that built the West is vanishing before our eyes, and the question that hangs over the entire region over the tens of millions who depend on the river and the nation whose food it helps to grow, is whether we will act in time to save what remains, or whether we will let the river slip away. That question, more than any other, will define the future of the American West, and the answer lies in the choices we make now, in the years that remain before the time runs out. There is, in the end, a strange kind of hope embedded in the very urgency of the crisis, because the fact that America is running out of time also means that the moment of decision has arrived, that the comfortable delay is over, and the region can no longer avoid the reckoning it has postponed for so long. Crises have a way of concentrating the mind, of forcing action that years of gradual warning could not compel, and the disappearing river, for all the danger it represents, may yet prove to be the catalyst that finally brings the region to live within the limits of its water. The reservoirs still hold water, the river still flows, the cities still function, and the window, though narrowing, has not yet closed. What is required is the will to act, the wisdom to share the sacrifice, and the recognition that the abundance of the past is gone and will not return. If the region can summon these things, the story of the disappearing river need not end in catastrophe, but in a hard-won adaptation, a new way of living with a smaller river that could stand as